let me tell you, the history of Dallas is much more interesting than the history of Dallas. I mean, they have families down here that just make our show look like cream of wheat. Well, it's kind of interesting because the people that produced Dallas produced The Waltons, which was a sweet show about a nice family and so forth. And it was a real departure from their usual. And yeah, I don't know, it was just fun, and it developed. I mean, I always considered it a cartoon. And I always thought of Dallas as kind of funny, because it was kind of funny. But it was a human funny. I don't know really where it falls, drama or cartoonish or whatever, but it carved a place in history, that's for sure. Well, one of the producers had been a producer on I Dream of Jeannie at one time. And so he remembered me for that, and I don't know why he wanted me for that role, but it turned out pretty good for me.
I had just come off a television show called The Man from Atlantis, and it had just literally been canceled. They knew they were going to cancel it, so my agent was finding scripts, and I had 5 scripts. I can only remember 4 of them, but Dallas was one. I was going to be the father of Lassie, that was the other one. Speaking of pioneers, the title of this show, there was a pilot for a show called Young Pioneers with Linda Pearl, and I was going to be the husband on that, or I was going to read for the husband on that. All of these were potential. And Dallas, and I can't remember the 5th one. But my wife and I literally read all of them and thought, well, Lassie's a slam dunk cinch because everybody loves Lassie and it's always done. And I thought maybe I could do Lassie, and it really was like a pinwheel and go, oh, Dallas, let's try Dallas. And that was it. It wasn't based on, isn't this going to be wonderful, and isn't the character of Bobby wonderful? No, I was panicked because I'd been out of work for a week, and literally, and I just wanted to make a choice, and we relied on our great fortune and picked Dallas. And then, we got the script reading at Warner Brothers, and I met Larry and Linda and Jim Davis and Barbara Belguedes and Steve Canale and Charlene Tilton. And I said, these are the best people in the world at the very first time we met. And it turned out to be magic casting and the most fundamentally important decision I ever made other than marrying my wife.
That first audition, I remember it very, very clearly because I was doing a series with Norman Lear called All That Glitters. And Ruth Comforte, who was the casting lady, was asked to cast these very small characters on a new series called Dallas. And she called them about me, and she said, I'd like Linda Gray to come in. And they were like, who? We don't know, and we have someone else in mind. And we already were kind of very close to making an offer. She said, well, before you do, please, 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 please see her. So I got an audition at 5 o'clock on Friday, which is death. Going up 5 o'clock. Nobody's interested. They're all looking at their watches. They want to go home. So there was no dialogue for Sue Ellen. So they wrote me an audition phone call. And it was Sue Ellen's side of a phone conversation. JR was calling her to tell her that he was so sorry he couldn't be home for John Ross's birthday party because he was busy at the office. Well, we know about JR. He wasn't at the office. Anyway, so I did this monologue, one-way conversation. And the most interesting thing was that I knew in that room, I knew that I got that job. And oddly enough, it was my friend they were considering for the role. It was Mary Fran, who ended up being Bob Newhart's wife, thank God. I love Mary. Mary and I were dear friends. I didn't really know it at the time that she was the one. But there I was, and I was walking to my car, and I thought, I've got this job. It was odd. It was the oddest feeling. It was a woman's intuition. It was something, but I felt it. It was palpable, and I knew. And I walked to the car, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting, but I have this job. And then it wasn't too long after that I got the phone call that I did actually have it.
When I read the first description of the character of Lucy Ewing, I just knew I had to play that part. it was in a magazine called Dronologue, which is now Backstage West. And they put out casting notices. And I read the summary of Dallas. It was a mini-series. I read the list of characters: JR, Bobby, Pam, Lucy Ewing. She was a manipulative sex pot, raised with a silver spoon, and had everything she wanted. And it said, but her mother and father were kicked off the ranch. And I just knew, I said, she doesn't have everything she wants. She doesn't have love. She doesn't have acceptance. I just said there's something to that character that there's a vulnerability about her. There's something more than just meets the eye on the surface. And Barbara Miller was casting. And Barbara Miller had put me on Eight Is Enough, Code Red, a couple of little guest star parts. And she said, nope, they want somebody a little older, somebody with more experience. So I would go sneak into the studio, and you can't do this now at all, but back then, security wasn't as tight. And I was able to sneak onto the studio lot. If there was a truck driving by or something, I'd run along or just act like I knew where I was going. And I would go to Barbara Miller's office, and her assistant, Irene Mariana, was there, and I was able to sneak in, and I would go every day, please, let me come in and read, please. No, 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 you're not right, you're not right. I go, yes, I am. Finally, they said, come back tomorrow at 5. I said, yay, can I have a script? No, they wouldn't give me a script or any sides material to read. So the next day at 1 o'clock, when I knew they were at lunch, I snuck into the studio and into their office and went through their desk, and I stole, well, borrowed a copy of the script and went to my acting coach, Jeff Corey at the time, and worked with him and came back in time for my audition at 5, and I was fortunate enough to get the part.
I think on Dallas, I'm not going to say it was melodramatic, but they had categories. What was kind of wonderful in the Overwash were the guys were guys, and you know they were cowboys, and the women were gorgeous Dallas ladies. You know, all of them gorgeous, looked like former Miss Dallas, every single one of them, including the one that was my daughter, Lucy, Charlene Tilton. They were all Miss something, Miss Fort Worth, Miss Dallas, I don't know, Laredo, all those cities in the South. But they were, so it was very, not stereotypical, but might have started out that way with the villain, JR, the best villain ever on TV, I think. God bless Larry Hagman. But they had all those kind of stereotypes. And I think that that was one of the most establishing things about Dallas and made it kind of in a category all by itself.
Originally, the show was Romeo and Juliet. It was Bobby and Pam, Montagues and Capulets, and all the big. If that would have been the follow-through premise, we'd have been down in 2 years. You know, the Dallas was never intended to be J.R. Ewing, this evil man you love to hate and hate to love, and all of that stuff. That was purely accidental. But once Leonard Katzman saw it, then they wrote to it, and that's when the ratings just went through the roof.
Well, you know, when you're starting anything new, you're feeling out everybody and they're getting to know each other and so forth. And Mr. Katzman, who was the producer, was a wonderful guy, and he and I struck up a friendship. And he recognized that I knew a lot about Texas. I mean, I was born in Fort Worth and brought up in a town called Weatherford, which is on the other side of Fort Worth. It's about 60 miles west of Dallas. And so I knew the vernacular and the mindset and so forth. And I modeled my character after a gentleman who just passed away recently, Jess Hall Jr. And he was the quintessential JR. And I just took his character and lived it.
Bobby was going to die at the end of the 5th episode. And then it was going to be the character of Pam living in the South Fork Ranch with all of her arch enemies, et cetera, et cetera. And in a meeting at the networks, Leonard sat there, and he's old school producer, and he listened to everybody talking, and he said very quietly, why does she stay in the house? And they said, well, because, he goes, she just inherited like $100 million. Why is she living upstairs in a bedroom? And there was silence, and somebody in the room said, maybe Bobby doesn't die. And there was my career. Quite literally is exactly how it happened, because I was going to be out after 5 episodes. That was before I ever found any of this out. By the time we had the 5 episodes, it was a continuing story with Bobby in it. But originally he was going to die had it not been for Leonard.
When we first started, Larry Hagman was the ringleader, and he brought us all together with champagne and put us in this car we called the armored car that he had in Dallas. And it was freezing cold, it was snowing, and we were staying in a little hotel with little tiny rooms with cockroaches were crawling all over. And it was, Larry brought us together and we bonded. And this is not something that you can force to make happen. There is a chemistry and a camaraderie that happened off screen that translated to the screen in Dallas. So it's a gift. Barbara Miller was a brilliant casting director. Our producer, Leonard Katzman, was an amazing producer. So they knew what they were doing, but they did a great job in assembling the cast that they did.
Well, you know, those are the things that are hard to explain, to verbalize. They really are. But there's an instant chemistry that we had. I can't describe it. It's magical.
I remember walking into the first reading, and I had my Western garb that I always wore anyhow, and I had a case of champagne in a big leather sack with ice in it. So that's what lightened me. I walked in the door, and she said, I'm your wife. I'm Sue Ellen. And I said, hello, darling. And that was right there. I knew that woman was just the best leading lady I'd ever have.
Larry walked in, cowboy hat, slung over his shoulder. He had carved leather saddlebags filled with ice and 2 bottles of champagne. Big creature that walked in. I mean, it's an awesome sight. And he looked at me and he went, hello, darling. And I thought, well, this is Major Nelson. Major Nelson and the Man from Atlantis. I said, what the hell is this? A sitcom? I didn't know. What is this? Where am I? The only one for me that had any substance was Barbara Bel Geddes. I thought, okay, all right, there's hope here. But that's what happened. And then we had our first scene together in Dallas. And we started bickering. And honestly, to this day, we do that. He'll say, Miss Gray, where did you get that sweater? And I'll say something, whatever, I bought it. And he, oh, well, did you get it on sale? Or he just does it, and I do it right back. And then people, I mean, if I haven't seen him for a while, and we're together in the same room, we'll both start with something. And people around go, oh boy, this is like a real J.R. Swellen scene. And you can feel them kind of start backing away. It's like, I'm going to throw a bottle at him or something weird's going to happen. I don't know what it is. It's magic. It's that damn twinkle in those blue eyes that gets me every time.
Dallas wouldn't have survived 13 years if JR was a cardboard cutout. Larry Hagman, because of the consummate actor he is and his talent, kept JR so alive, so multifaceted. That's why they call him, that's why they said the villain, you love to hate him, because if he just played it the way, a lot of actors would have played the way it was written, you wouldn't have cared about JR. You wouldn't have cared about his family or anything. And I think that that Larry led he was our ringleader on the show, but all of the actors, I mean, I haven't seen the show in forever, and I had to put on a DVD to watch something, to answer some questions for somebody, and I said to Larry, after I watched like a couple of episodes, I said, damn, this was good. I really get what all the hub is about. It still holds up. Yeah, we have really big hair, dripping lip gloss, and shoulder pads, but outside of that, I mean, the show holds up. And he said, little Niecy, good writing and good acting will stand the test of time. And it really does.
Larry's the Pied Piper, and he always has been that, long before Dallas and long after Dallas, and now here Dallas again. He has always been the marker by which we all know how far to go, how far not to go, how to pull back, how to always do your work. We can have as much fun, especially Larry and myself, we can have as much fun as two people can possibly have, as long as the minute the company needed the camera to roll, we could play our parts the way we're supposed to. And that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes people can't gather it back together, and he was instrumental in establishing that.
I don't call these things with Larry his idiosyncrasies. I think of him as Larry's a force of nature. So back in the day, you can't now, but people would smoke on the soundstage. And Larry was an ex-smoker, one of those vicious ex-smokers that just will blow it right back in your face. And he always had those little portable fans that would blow it back in your face. He went through a period of time that he did not speak on Sundays. And I think the rest of us kind of liked it. And he knows we did. Now, I got a call one morning, early Sunday. It's like 8 o'clock in the morning in Dallas. Hello? Hello? Larry, put Mai on the phone. That's Larry's wife. Mai gets on the phone. What does Uncle Larry want? He wants to go get chili. He wants you to go get chili with him. I said, well, when? She said, now. I go, it's 8 in the morning. Where? I don't know. He wants to go find some chili hot enough to suit him. So I said, all right, I'll be there in half an hour. And we went and spent the day. I said, there's not going to be anything open. Larry, his son Preston, and myself, we ended up just going from place to place, sampling chili all over Dallas, and then went and saw Smokey and the Bandit. And he didn't talk the whole day. It was a Sunday. We had a great time.
He was basically a comedy actor at that point. You know, until he did Dallas, I don't think people really thought of him as a dramatic actor. He was just really, first of all, very talented, and second of all, just so much fun. You know, I mean, you know, there's the famous things about the days that he didn't talk out of Malibu, and we'd all go out to Malibu and go marching down the beach, and his wife Mai had created a spa in their house, jacuzzi kind of thing, and we'd all sit around in there. I mean, it was, you know, again, here I am, you know, just new to California, green as anything, and I'm out in Malibu, you know, with these great people. It was pretty amazing.
That was a big deal. That was a big deal. I think 390 million people saw it. I think that's conservative too, but I know that during that period of time, restaurants would shut down if they didn't have a big television set. Nobody would go out to dinner, and then people were having parties, Dallas parties and so forth.
Dallas was even popular before the Who Shot JR, to the extent that the networks kept coming back to the company mid-season and saying, could we have 2 more episodes? Could we have 3 more, 4 more episodes? Because they were making so much money on the show. So Leonard had scripted Dallas for that year. I think it was the end of the 2nd year that he got shot. I'm very bad at this, but whatever year that was that he got shot, they had scripted up to, and let's say it was 24 episodes. And they knew the big cliffhanger at 24 was going to be something. And then the network said, we need 2 more episodes. And they went, you know, you can imagine they've done this whole Bible of plot and everything, and they had to figure out how to extend and have a cliffhanger in 2 more episodes. And that's when somebody in the room again said, well, let's shoot somebody. And the obvious choice was, let's shoot JR. Everybody wants to do it anyway. And that's how it happened. So they shot JR. He collapses on the floor, that iconic shot of him lying on the floor, freeze frame. We had 3 months hiatus, and then the actors went on strike. So the whole audience worldwide was counting on in 3 months, knowing who shot JR, does he live or die? It really wasn't who shot JR, it was does he live or die? That was the real premise of the cliffhanger. The Who shot happened after we started the following season, and then I think, went about 5 episodes before we discovered who did it. But the real cliffhanger was, does he live or die? So actors went on strike. The hiatus, instead of 3 months, was 6 months. It was huge. It was over a 90-day strike. Very, very unfortunate thing for the business. Very fortunate for Dallas. And on top of that, so you have cliffhanger, hiatus, actors on strike, and Larry says, if it's ever going to happen, I have to do it now. And he decided to renegotiate his contract, which takes a lot of nerve. You're only 2 years into a show, but he held out. He didn't report to work.
Dallas was a huge success, and I thought, well, you know, I'm getting a secondary salary here, so I thought it's a good time for me to ask for a little more. Well, that was when they shot me, and I figured, well, if I don't get the salary raise and they fire me, I'll never work in the industry again, so I have to go for it all the way. And I did. I asked for a huge amount. And they didn't think it was going to last that long. And that was like in the 3rd year. And so when they gave me that raise with the incremental wages down the line, I mean, it lasted for, 10 years after that. So it turned out to be a pretty good salary. So I was the first guy to negotiate that. So I figured all those kids on Friends owe me at least 10%. You know? They were getting $1 million each. Good for them. I just want a little piece.
You know, the world knew that he was holding out. So if JR lives, is it going to be JR? Is it, or they're going to recast it? It built up such a groundswell of interest that by the time we started the season, and he still wasn't at work, he missed the first episode. By the time he got back to work and we started to address the who shot him and the fact that he's alive, the entire world wanted to know the answer. And it took us to a level that most actors never get to experience. The interesting thing to do Dallas in, and I came back, I think in '87, it might have been, I think so. There were minimal paparazzi, there were minimal, you know, Entertainment Tonight shows. People weren't hounding and skulking and stalking and all of that. But there was enough interest in the fact that the press had come out that I was returning to the show of figuring out how. So Leonard had figured out that it was going to be a dream, that I had to come back. He knew the premise of the shower scene, etc. But he knew that in one sense you can't trust anyone because you have to trust everyone, and that's the impossible. If there's one person that will spill the beans, then you can't trust anyone. So instead of doing the shower on the set at MGM Studios and just deciding to do that, they got a completely different crew. The only people on the set that were from Dallas was Leonard Katzman, the producer, and our unit production manager, who was his nephew. So that was the connection, and myself. And we hired a commercial production company in Los Angeles to shoot an Irish Spring commercial. And we spent all day in the middle of a huge soundstage with a little tiny shower built right in the center. And I was wet and lathering up for about 8 hours. And Leonard knew, because he had written the script, that all he needed was for me to turn to camera, which would be Victoria, turn to camera and go, "Good morning." But I would go, "Good morning," beat, beat, beat. And you can have a good morning too if you wake up like the Duffy family with Irish Spring, and we do the whole commercial. And then Leonard, who was directing it, would say, "You know, we didn't have enough foam on the." They had to make it look like we were really shooting a commercial. Because if we just did one take and left, somebody would go, So we spent all day shooting a commercial for Good Morning.
Dallas was a forerunner. We brought out issues, bigger than life, of course, but we brought out issues when Michele had mastectomy and Sue Ellen had the drinking problem. It was, Betty Ford started the Betty Ford Clinic. It was at a time where society was changing. Things were no longer pushed under the rug. There were no 800 numbers at that time. Where people could call and get help. It was, you know, if you drank, that was acceptable. Drugs were certainly not, but people tried to do the best they could. And instead of talking to a therapist, if you went to a therapist, you were considered crazy. And so people just sort of quietly, they didn't know what to do. So women drank, men drank. You saw a lot of that on Dallas. But those issues were brought up on Dallas, which I found was absolutely fascinating.
that was my favorite storyline for Lucy. And I think it was only a 3-episode arc, but Lucy met and fell in love with a young man named Kit Mainwaring, who was the son of the other powerful oil family in Dallas, the Mainwarings. And he was good looking, and he was nice and wealthy, like on the surface, a perfect match for Lucy. Well, come to find out, poor Kit Mainwaring was struggling about being gay. Now, back then, we couldn't even use the word gay. We had to say homosexual. So, this had never been done on television. They handled it beautifully. And JR knew that Kit was gay and was throwing the wedding for Lucy. He didn't care about poor Lucy. He just wanted the two rich families to join together. So when Kit Mainwaring sat Lucy down and came out of the closet and had to admit, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. I'm gay. I'm a homosexual. And Lucy was devastated, but she stood up to JR. She said, no, I'll handle JR. He's not going to blackmail you. He's not going to hurt your family. I'll take care of him.
It defies common sense logic as to why this show has the international appeal that it does. Whether it's dubbed in another language seems to make no difference whatsoever. Whether people even, if it's not dubbed and they don't understand the language, which has been in several cases where it's not dubbed in some foreign country, a small foreign country, so they watch it and they're just kind of trying to figure out who everybody is, but they love watching it. It is, again, it's magic. And I think we did have an influence, sometimes not the best, but always attractive. We showed Americans to be quite materialistic, ruthless. That pretty well describes Larry's character. But we also were able to show, a moral compass, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of equilibrium, and that was the Victoria characters of Pam and my character of Bobby. So there was always a balance. And if you only concentrate on one character, it's all about goody two-shoes, and you miss the dynamic of the other side of the human being. So we did a lot of stuff in terms of, I think, the world's perception of a basic Americana trait.
When I would have the opportunity to go to different countries, Dallas was what the rest of the world perceived as the American way of life. Obviously a very small segment, but the world perceived it like that. And it was the 80s. And it was greed and excess and money and power, all that.
I had a friend of mine from Russia. His name was Konchalovsky, and his father was a great director, and he was a director. He used to come over to America, and he would bring over big tins of caviar, beluga caviar, and I would trade him like 50 cassettes of Dallas for a liter of, it was a good deal for me. And he'd take those cassettes back of Dallas and clone them, and to the extent that after about 10 of them, you couldn't tell what it was. It could have been Knots Landing, for that matter. But my theory was the reason the Soviet Union fell down is because they were seeing what we had here, all the cars and the beautiful clothes and the food and so forth, because they didn't have any information about the Western world over there. You were not allowed to see anything. So I thought that maybe Dallas was the downfall of the Soviet Union.
The episode of Knots Landing that I did was, I had a great time doing it, and it was a soap opera. Then I think it became something else, and they didn't even really talk about the Ewings or Dallas. It became its own entity, which it's great. It was very successful.
I think that Knots, more than any other of the, if you want to call them soaps, had their feet on the ground more than any of the others, and they were all wonderful. I mean, I'd rather see the diamonds dripping and the furs falling off, sliding off their arms, and throwing down the drinks at the liquor cart or whatever, the bar cart. But the truth was that Knots had characters and people that I think more people could actually relate to, and we were real. David Jacobs used to say that Dallas is about them, and Knots is about us.
One of the reasons Knots Landing was so successful at the time was because we always had our finger on the pulse of what America was at any given time, and we changed when society changed. We went through five presidents: Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush. Who am I missing? Someone. But anyway, we were coming out of Reaganomics when Dynasty Dallas became this show that was about everything middle class kind of aspired or wanted to watch and see. You know, a saga of people who could actually wear maybe tiaras. And it was all about oil and get rich. And Knots Landing wasn't about this elitist group. Knots Landing was about middle class America on any level you could find middle class. We were the neighbors who were looking over the picket fence at life and community. The audience, I think, would laugh with us. There was an identification. People embraced the characters as they would their friends. We were in their homes. We on Knots Landing, we, the characters on Knots Landing, would be home watching Dynasty in Dallas, if you want to take it literally. We'd be watching those shows for the very reason our audience were watching the shows. That was the difference between our show and theirs. And of course, you know, I think that's why they identified so much and why Knots Landing was on for 14 years.
For the most part, Dallas and Dynasty dealt with much wealthier people, so that the average person out there watching television couldn't relate as much to them. I mean, they lived in Dallas in this big, huge mansion, and you know, Knots Landing was a cul-de-sac in a suburb, kind of. You know, it was the kind of house that people who were watching lived in. And Dynasty, the same thing. It was all about. And when I came on the show, I was the sister of Karen's husband, and worked in the used car lot. I was the bookkeeper. And I did feel that with the show, it needed a little bit of that glamour. That it was, I thought, not a good idea to have people come home from work, sit down, watch television, and watch people in a used car lot. So I thought it needed a little bit more glamour. So I pushed for my character to become successful in business and, you know, get more glamorous on that end. So then the show had both. It had the glamour, but it had the reality. Everybody else lived in the cul-de-sac, you know, still. So that it had the broad range, had the base of the reality, and it had the glitz of the glamour.